Geopolitics and Empire is joined by returning guest Yves Engler. He's a Montreal-based activist and author who has published 12 books, including his latest Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. Welcome back, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a few years. Some years ago, I've interviewed you. I don't even remember, once or twice, perhaps. And let me just start by saying that if you have not purchased some of Yves Engler's books, you're truly missing out. I've studied the American and European military-industrial complex for a long time, and Yves truly fills in the gap when it comes to Canada. His writing on the matter is to the point, backed by a lot of evidence, and demonstrates the role Canada plays in the Anglo-American Empire's global adventures. And I think we should start with your recent speaking of truth to power, Yves. I believe there were two recent instances where you dropped in on government meetings or conferences and called out the Canadian military-industrial complex. The most recent was you interrupting a press conference given by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland to ask if she's a warmonger and to criticize her for devoting $500 million for weapons to fight Russia.
Ça me fait vraiment plaisir de travailler avec.
Are you a warmonger? Are you a warmonger? $500 million in weapons to Ukraine to fight war. Do you want Third World War with Russia? Are you a warmonger? Why didn't you support the Minsk Accord? Why didn't you support a negotiated settlement? Why didn't you support the Minsk Accord? Why do you support promoting NATO expansion? Shame on you! Shame on you! You want Third World War? Don't escalate. We don't want nuclear war. Shame on you. Why did you promote NATO expansion? Please. Shame on you. No, $500 million. That's unprecedented for weapons. Pour tuer les gens. L'escalade. On veut pas l'escalade. Arrête la guerre. Arrête avec l'escalade. Stop escalating the conflict. Shame on you. Shame on you.
And the other where you interrupt Canadian Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly's speech asking to stop using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia at the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations.
Stop escalating the war. Stop sending arms. Why didn't you push Kyiv to sign the Minsk Accord? Why no to NATO? Shame on you. You're going to push us to World War III. Shame on you. No to war. No to escalation. Stop sending weapons. Stop training the military. Stop using Russia or stop using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. No to NATO. No à l'OTAN. No à l'OTAN. No à la guerre. No à l'escalation. Tu devrais avoir honte. Stop using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Stop using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. No to war. No to NATO.
Could you tell us about those two events? What was going through your head, what happened, your motivations, how you prepared, and, how it all went down?
Yeah, well, the first one was a few weeks ago. A friend in Waterloo sent me the information that Mélanie Joly was giving this speech about Ukraine at the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations. And we had a group before the pandemic that was called Disruption Network Canada, and where we, across the country, we sort of a loose network of people who shared information of when politicians, cabinet ministers, the prime minister were speaking in different cities across the country, and we would show up and, various forms of political messaging, from disruptions to holding placards to just asking tough questions. And but that, of course, was mostly shut down during the pandemic. But my friend sent me the contact information for Joly, and it was early morning breakfast meeting, and I thought about the different ways of maybe getting inside the meeting, and I decided I would just show up late, and I would just try to walk into the meeting and hope that they didn't realize that I didn't pay $100 for the breakfast and to be there. And I was able to basically show up late, have the woman who was at the door respond to me very nicely, and had to sort of open the door before she realized I didn't have a ticket. By that point, I was already inside, and then I spent about 50 seconds inside the room, challenging Mélanie Joly's position on escalating the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, and saying that Canada was had failed to support the Minsk Accords to try to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine, had been, sending weapons, had been, pushing NATO expansion eastward, and basically said, I don't think we want nuclear war. We don't want a even greater conflict than is already going on. And so doing that and having success in doing that kind of rekindled a bit of the spirit that we had prior to the pandemic, where, trying to show up at different ministers' meetings. And I got to say that, I questioned doing the disruption with Melanie Joly, because the way these things work is oftentimes you just go there, you try to get in, you're not able to get in. Sometimes you end up getting arrested. And in this case, I didn't. But, you sort of have to expend a certain amount of energy, whether it succeeds or not. But with Joly, what kind of forced me to really do it was this sort of sense that this is, we're going down some crazy path, and there's very little resistance to this. There's almost no space within the dominant media to say anything but what the politicians in Ottawa and Washington want to be heard. So it's really important to be there and do disruptive things that kind of break through the media blackout. Actually, after that, I found out that Prime Minister Trudeau was participating in this parade, a Greek Independence Day parade, and I actually went up there to heckle him, and I did heckle him. But I had some problems with my video recorder, so I failed to actually record that. And then last week, I challenged him on Ukraine and on Canadian policy in Ukraine. And then last week, Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister and deputy prime minister, and I should say the former Canadian foreign minister, who had a very hawkish, aggressive policy across the world on, vis-a-vis Venezuela, but also, with regards to Ukraine. Her grandfather's was a neo-Nazi, or was a Nazi propagandist during World War II in the Ukraine, and when the Nazis got driven out of the Ukraine, he followed them and ultimately emigrated to Canada. But a couple of days before her press conference here in Montreal, which was about kind of promoting the budget, and in the budget they not only massively increased military spending, which was already increasing, they specifically devoted $500 million to arms to Ukraine. And this is on top of about 90 million that's already been sent or announced in recent weeks. I think this is unprecedented in Canadian foreign policy history, of having a budget allotment, quite a significant budget allotment for weapons for a war that is ongoing. Again, this is not selling weapons. This is giving. This is donating. The other forms of assistance to Ukraine, that's always loans. The weapons are always free. Those are donations, which is very telling about the policies of the people in Ottawa. But yeah, so I got into the press conference after actually trying a previous event earlier in that day that Chrystia Freeland was speaking at and failing to get in. And I got into the press conference and I called her a warmonger, and of course, her security and the RCMP, quickly pushed me out of the room. But I was able to get the message across that this $500 million in weapons was wrong. The NATO expansion was wrong. The sort of escalation of Canadian policy was wrong. And fortunately, there was quite a bit of media in the room. Most of them ignored it, but a few of the major media outlets actually did cover the intervention. And interestingly, the next day, so the Canadian press mentioned that she had been called a warmonger. The next day, when she did a press conference, again promoting the budget, one of the articles was all focused on how sort of criticism of military spending. So I would like to believe that the intervention and prodding her as being a warmonger, that contributed to the media the next day also sort of asking questions down that path, which of course is a good thing.
So you didn't get arrested this time, or you didn't have your bank account frozen, nothing like that?
I didn't get arrested this time for either of those. But actually, interestingly, 2 weeks ago, between the Trudeau one and the Chrystia Freeland one, the U.S. ambassador was speaking at a hotel downtown, and I tried to get inside to that, and I actually did get arrested, and I got charged, and I have charges coming up. They accused me of assault, which is totally ridiculous. Whereas when I tried to get in the room, they actually assaulted me by throwing me to the ground. But in that case, they actually, kept me in the back of a paddy wagon or a cop car for an hour and a half. And they told me that the reason why they were coming down hard on me for this was partly because of the previous disruption of Mélanie Joly. And it was sort of like cumulative. But I think it's actually interesting that they take the U.S. ambassador more seriously than they take the Canadian Prime Minister, because I think that a disruption of the U.S. ambassador would be viewed as like a diplomatic incident, and it could have embarrassing relations, embarrass Canada-U.S. Relations. So they actually took that more. They were more aggressive on that than they were on the other incidents.
A message from our sponsors. The Nomos app will help you survive COVID-1984 and the Great Reset. Nomos is a time bank that can be used by communities anywhere in the world. You just need to talk people into using it. For example, if you go to your barber for a 30-minute haircut, your barber receives 30 minutes in his time bank. He can then use that time to pay for an appointment with the doctor. I've spoken to the developer who is passionate about creating solutions for surviving and thriving in the apocalypse. Nomos is available in both English and Spanish. Hurry and visit nomos.net before they roll out the cashless society and put you in the algorithm ghetto. Also, if you need health insurance that covers you wherever you may roam, check out my friend James Guzman's Borderless Health Insurance. One of the great things about living internationally is saving money on health care, but private care overseas can be expensive. Go to borderlesshealthinsurance.com to watch a short presentation on expat and digital nomad healthcare and sign up for a free consultation to review your options. Geopolitics and Empire needs funding. You can leave a donation, book a consultation, or become a member, which gets you access to my brief weekly commentary, a monthly newsletter of my thoughts, a private telegram, a monthly members group call, and my second premium broadcast called Dissident Thinker, where I conduct interviews and provide solo analysis. Dissident Thinker is also available on Rockfin and for supporters on Locals. Well, it's Washington. You're getting closer to the head of the imperial snake. And then just to get your thoughts on Canada and Ukraine as well. I think it was some weeks ago I read that a Canadian defense minister announced that they were giving, as you said, just straight up arms to Ukraine, so much that Canada was then lacking funds or arms for its own self, which is pretty crazy for. And Trudeau just announced Canada will be sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. He's in close contact with Zelensky. He's very responsive to Ukraine's needs. And so you've also written that the Russian invasion is both rational and imperialistic. I would tend to agree. What's your wider and general view on the Ukraine conflict, which many say is a proxy war between US, EU, NATO, and Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's both, Russia responded. I think it's clearly contrary to international law, Russia's invasion. And I think Russia's response is partly a reflection of the fact that it's a militarized country. It's has a long, imperial history, and it's responded in the way it has to clearly aggressive policies by US, Canada, Britain primarily. It's responded in the way it has because of its militaristic, imperialistic kind of orientation. But Canada is really a central player in all this. Canada has been a proponent of anti-Russian nationalistic forces in the Ukraine since before Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. I mean, Chrystia Freeland, the current deputy prime minister, she was there as a 20-year-old in the late 1980s, promoting oppositional groups within Ukraine. There's a whole longer history of Canada cultivating right wing, those who allied with the Nazis during World War II, as a force to undermine the Soviet Union. So there's this long history of Canada participating in that effort. But in recent decades, that escalation has just sort of continued from the point of independence. Most importantly, in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, it was the Canadian ambassador that they admitted this openly, that they were coordinating the opposition EU, U.S. ambassadors, their opposition to the government, and ultimately they claimed there was fraudulent elections, and they pumped in a bunch of money, supported a bunch of different opposition groups that succeeded in getting their candidate into the presidency. More significantly, in terms of understanding today, with the 2014 the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, the Canadian government played a very important role in that, and it didn't. And some people try to frame that as just supporting this popular uprising, and there clearly was a very important popular component to the movement against Yanukovych. Just as there was, let's be clear, in 2002 when Hugo Chavez was ousted, there were, I think, into the hundreds of thousands of people marching in Caracas against Chavez. There is a history. I don't want to claim Chavez and Yanukovych are the same politically. They're not. But there's a long history of foreign instigated coups that have a popular component to them. But the Canadian government was working to undermine Yanukovych from the get-go, right when he became president, and they certainly didn't like the fact that he brought in legislation saying that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, and then immediately after the 2004 overthrow of Yanukovych, they reversed that legislation and opened the door to NATO expansion. So Canada played an important role in the ouster of Yanukovych. For instance, during the last week of the protests, the opposition, the Maidan protesters, used the Canadian embassy. They were based in the Canadian embassy, including far right. We know that including far right activists. Early in the Maidan protests, John Baird, Canada's foreign minister, went to the square and supported. And Paul Grod, the head of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, very right-wing group, announced that Canada's foreign minister was there at the square, and apparently people started chanting "Canada, Canada." You can see there's images of the Canadian flag being hoisted up at the Maidan protests in one of the protest tents. So Canada supported the coup forces, or the bid to overthrow Yanukovych. Canada also promoting eastern expansion of NATO, going back into the early 1990s, right? Jean Chrétien, when he becomes prime minister in 93, immediately, not, within months of becoming prime minister, starts pushing for NATO expansion east, starts criticizing the Americans for not going fast enough with NATO expansion. And then when the first three countries get brought in to NATO, Eastern European countries, there's not even a debate in the House of Commons in Canada. It's just an order of council. There's not even like a public debate, even though if you look at the stories in the corporate media at the time, they repeatedly talk about how Russia was not happy with this, right? And this is before Vladimir Putin. This is during Yeltsin's time, and Chrétien even spends time like talking to Russian officials, saying, "No, this is not directed against you. This is not nothing to be worried about," et cetera, et cetera. So Canada has been pushing a sort of NATO expansion eastward. It supported the 2004 ouster of Yanukovych. After Yanukovych was ousted, Canada instigates the Operation Unifier, the training of the Ukrainian military that had partly collapsed because they didn't want to kill. In the Civil War, they didn't want to, kill other Ukrainians. And in fact, Jason Kenney, who was a former defense minister, right-wing Harper minister, Petro Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian president, actually says that Jason Kenney is the godfather of the modern Ukrainian military for his role in instigating the training mission of the Ukrainian forces. And just recently, Radio-Canada reported that they spent $900 million over 8 years on that training mission. And they also talked about how they showed all these examples of how far right neo-Nazi types were trained by Canadian trainers. Alongside that, there's of course weapons. Initially, before the full-fledged Russian invasion, they framed those weapons as always defensive, right? Which night goggles, flak jackets, that stuff, is that defensive? That's up for discussion. But basically, the Canadian government has been really pushing the Ukraine to go in an anti-Russia direction, and has been right at the center of building up the Ukrainian military. And I think to take a broader perspective of Canada-Russia relations, we have to remember that Canada invaded Russia in 1917, right? 6,000 Canadian troops invaded Russia. Even after the end of World War I, that ostensibly the rationale for the invasion was to get Russia to come back into World War I. But even after the end of World War I, Canadian troops landed in Vladivostok. After that period, Canada refused to have relations with Russia. There was a brief period where there was some degree of alignment during World War II, but then immediately you go into the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. So if you look at the century-long, or if you can go before that, you go to Crimea in the mid-1800s, Canadians helped the British in the war for Crimea with Russia. So if you take the long perspective, 150, 170 years, Canada has basically been at conflict with Russia throughout this whole period. So looking at what's going on in Ukraine within that context, I think helps to say, yes, what's happening to Ukrainians right now is horrible. And Russia deserves the primary blame for the horrors we're seeing right now, but there is a context that has brought us to this horrible situation, and the Canadian government has been right at the center of escalating that context.
Yeah, and this is exactly the way I like to look at things with this broad context. I was interviewed recently by my colleague on TNT Radio, and I was bringing up, you have to go back hundreds of years where you saw the French and Napoleon try to invade Russia, they failed. And then, Hitler and the Nazis tried, and then they failed. And I also view what's happening now is, the West has provoked Russia, as you said, by this NATO aggression. And then Russia felt like it had to preemptively do what it did. And it's eye-opening what you just described. A lot of us think that we always think it's the U.S. We've seen news stories of how the CIA has been training Ukrainian forces. And you just brought up how, Canada has been doing that as well. Canada has a huge role, as you just outlined. And we completely forget about that. We just think U.S. and Europe. Do you have any thoughts then on where this might go? Like, people talk about escalation in a World War III scenario. What are your thoughts on what the aftermath of what will happen with Ukraine?
Well, I have to say, I find it incredibly scary how the spiral of escalation is remarkable within Canadian politics, and I think that more or less exists within U.S. politics as well, where what they were saying a month ago, they were initially it was no weapons, then it was defensive weapons, then it was some more offensive weapons, and now it's like they're boasting about how we're sending heavy artillery. What's next, right? I mean, you're not getting that far away from are we going to start sending, nuclear weapons, right? Like what, where is that? Or the mother, whatever, the bomb that the Americans dropped on Afghanistan, the mother of all bombs, whatever that was called. That is very troubling. And I'm not seeing the off-ramp. I'm not seeing, simultaneously, there's nothing about negotiation. The Canadian officials, they would never publicly say we're trying to undermine negotiations, but clearly everything they're doing is trying to undermine negotiations and a peace accord. I think they think they have Russia caught in a damaging situation, and it's fairly low cost from the perspective of Ottawa and Washington. The Ukrainians are. Most of those who are dying are Ukrainian, and they're willing to just keep pumping in the weapons until there's no more Ukrainians that are to be killed kind of situation. So I don't know where this will go. I hope that there will be negotiations as quick as possible, and there's no justice is coming out of this. Right, that's clear. Right, it's any scenario is going to be an unjust situation and all kinds of violation of international law. It's a question of minimizing the damage, and the damage is also not just directly. I mean, the Ukrainians are clearly those who are the worst of it, but it's also the broader political reverberations of this. I mean, you have huge increase of military spending in many countries at a time where we have to be devoting all our resources towards fighting the climate crisis, which is barreling down. The political attention that's been devoted to Ukraine has taken away from reporting on the UN IPCC reports about where the climate crisis is going. So there's already these very damaging political impacts. But I don't know. I mean, I think that if there's not, if anti-war forces in Canada, the U.S. and some other countries don't start raising their voices to put the brakes on this sort of escalatory policies, I wouldn't surprise me if Canadian and U.S. troops openly, I think there already are almost certainly some U.S. troops and probably some Canadian troops on the ground in Ukraine, but that they start becoming openly involved in the conflict, and that just has greater and greater dangers that are possible.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this before. Lately, and we've seen on U.S. media, NBC and other such outlets, they've been bringing on soldiers, openly calling for, sending U.S. They were literally saying direct conflict with Russia, to send American troops, literally fire on Russian troops. So they're basically calling for World War III. And then there's articles coming out of New York Times discussing now tactical mini nukes. And so, yeah, that can happen. And as well, I recently interviewed French intellectual Thierry Meyssan of Voltaire Network, and his view was that this Ukraine conflict was meant to destroy Europe or the European Union. In any case, we're going to see the reverberations of, we've got the energy issue. This is putting a big, it's creating problems for the economy, inflation, and many people are suffering economically as well all over the planet, breaking down supply chains. I thought it'd be also worth mentioning, propaganda in the media space. I assigned portions of your book, I think it's your 2009 book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, is reading for my students years ago when I taught North America politics here in Mexico. It was a great resource. In your 2016 book, A Propaganda System, How Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, it details how the corporate elites funding for university programs and think tanks, basically that system of propaganda. And when I was teaching in Mexico, when the topic of Canada came up, I cannot tell you how many times I heard, especially the female students, exclaiming how handsome, and amazing Trudeau was. They were completely blinded, and they thought everything about Canada was great. The programming and propaganda was so strong, and I felt it my job to try and break that trance. Could you just comment on, today in Canada, and not just Canadian, but the American and just in general the Western propaganda regarding the push for war and all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's unrelenting, to be honest with you. Like today's National Post newspaper, now it's about two months into the Russian invasion. All 4 stories on the front page are dealing with Russia, Ukraine. I was going to look into this actually just after this interview. I bet you that they, in today's paper, the National Post has as much coverage of Russia, Ukraine as they had of the conflict in the Donbass in the previous 8 years. Right before the Russian invasion. This just is today's single issue of the paper, and even probably it's a quarter as much as they've covered the war in Yemen over the past 7 years. So the media is just completely, pushing the drum beats of war, and it's kind of contradictory, because on one hand, we're not supposed to be in this war. Canada's not supposed to be fighting this war, but they clearly are acting like we are fighting this war, which I think in some ways is obviously closer to the truth. Canada is involved in this war, but the media sphere. I mean, on foreign policy. At the best of times, there's very limited space for critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy, and in a time like this, that limited discussion is almost nil. I did a story about the chief military reporter at the CBC, the main state broadcaster, just actually before the Russian invasion, just at a time when there was sort of ramping up of tensions. And because I always wonder this, is that, are these reporters ignorant, lazy, or are they just, serving power? And I showed how Murray Brewster is his name, how that if he just would have reported on what he had previously reported on, so if he would have been lazy, he would have done his readers and his viewers much better service. So he had reported on the fact that he was actually the one who exposed the fact that the far right, or that the protesters, the Maidan protesters, used the Canadian embassy in flagrant violation of Canadian law or of international law to oust Yanukovych. So if he would have reported on that, that would have been context that readers would have liked, that would have been very helpful to readers. He reported on previously that when Canada pushed to have Ukraine join NATO, that Germany, France, and of course Russia opposed that push. So that would have been something that he could provide some context on. He also previously reported on the fact that Canada had trained some neo-Nazi types with Operation Unifier. Again, that was context that would have been helpful to people to make sense of the growing tensions. But instead, he just basically repeated exactly what the NATO officials and what the Canadian government wanted. So it's not a question of laziness. It was a question of understanding the sort of political context and being deferent to power and basically just puppeting what was necessary to from his standpoint to maintain his position as the chief defense correspondent at the CBC. But yeah, it generalizes. I think that there is this. Canada has done a very good job to speaking specifically to the whole Trudeau kind of myth, is of presenting itself as a sort of liberal, less bad than Washington, sort of more kind of humane, and people around the world have not just in Canada, but people around the world have to a large extent bought into that, in large part because Canada does have powerful propaganda apparatus itself, right? The fact that they speak the two main colonial languages, English and French, well-educated population that has, people within influential media around the world, has things like the Radio Canada International, which is, Canada's equivalent to the U.S.
Radio Free Europe, or what is it called?
Yeah, Radio Free Europe, exactly. And so it has this powerful propaganda system to push its perspective around the world, which if there isn't a progressive forces within Canada challenging that and putting out a counter narrative, then of course people around the world will tend to absorb that. But I have to say that Trudeau, as much as he's sort of framed as this positive politician, when they went for the Canada under Trudeau tried to get a seat on the United Nations Security Council, I guess it's now almost 2 years ago, they were defeated, right? They were defeated badly in that vote. So the people, within governments around the world, they understand that Canada is this very closely aligned with Washington country that also has important, this massive mining sector that's involved in abuses abroad, as a significant banking sector that's big player around the world. And so I think that, the people who were, the diplomats around the world sort of understand that the rhetoric is not to be taken too seriously.
Yeah, the Canadian mining companies here in Mexico. I'm a nationalized Mexican, so they're taking our resources. I just, one of my last questions in your 2018 book, Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, you explain how Canada's major left-wing political party has backed unjust wars and how the left has gone along with the war machine. We see this in the U.S. as well. I like how Max Blumenthal of Gray Zone recently put it. He was saying that basically today the main constituency for World War III are the liberal Democrats. He gives credit for this achievement to the intelligence community and national security state through all of this, media manipulation and stuff. What's your take on how the establishment has been able to mold the opinion, and how a large part of the left is going along with the war narrative?
Well, I mean, today, Jagmeet Singh, who's the leader of the NDP, which is the, social democratic traditional left party, he was asked what he thought about Justin Trudeau yesterday saying that Canada was sending heavy weaponry, heavy artillery, and he said yes, we should be sending, we should be giving the Ukrainians whatever they need. I don't know where he was going to put the endpoint on the whatever they need, because like I said, I mean, you were talking about tactical nuclear weapons or something, right? Like how far are they willing to go down that path? But they have just consistently supported they supported this budget that had $500 million in weapons to Ukraine. They supported the budget that had a massive increase in military spending. It was an NDP that actually put forward a resolution in the House of Commons that was basically supporting the conflict. They all showed up when Zelensky spoke and gave him a standing ovation. Before Russia's invasion, one NDP MP, Leah Gazan in Winnipeg, one of the more left wing of the MPs, made some comments saying that we shouldn't be supporting this far right regime in Kyiv, and she got attacked viciously. The media came at her viciously, and the rest of the party basically hung her out to dry. So yeah, I mean the NDP has completely gone along. They are been cheerleading. The NDP's foreign critic was pushing for Ukraine to join NATO just a few months ago, right? Just before the tensions really got going. So they completely, I mean, that's partly tied to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. There is a Ukrainian Canadian lobby in this country that is influential, and so that is a dynamic that does play out in understanding why the NDP is so aggressive. But more generally, I mean, the NDP supported 2011 bombing of Libya. It was unanimous in the House of Commons. On the second vote in the House of Commons, the sole Green MP, Elizabeth May, voted against, but the first vote was unanimous. I think a few of the NDP MPs just left, weren't in the House, so they didn't have to vote in favor of it. And if you go back, in 1999, when Canada was part of the NATO bombing of the former Yugoslavia, then it was probably the most left-wing foreign affairs critic in the history of the NDP, Sven Robinson, somebody somebody who's identified with like Noam Chomsky and stuff like that, somebody who's way on the left of the NDP. He backed the bombing for the first month. Finally, a month in, he shifted. But so there's this, this long history. Go back to the Korean War and the CCF, the predecessor NDP, supporting the Korean War, supporting the establishment of NATO in 1949. Canada was right at the center of establishing NATO. Canada, US, and Britain were really the three countries that got it off the ground. And the CCF NDP political party, they backed it, and they whenever members opposed these efforts, they did everything they could, all kinds of ugly anti-democratic shenanigans within the party to block resolutions challenging NATO, and it ultimately took 2 decades for activists within the party to finally get a resolution passed criticizing NATO, is partly because members were being thrown out of the party when they challenged NATO, including people who had been previously elected as NDP members. So they're wedded. They're wedded to militarism. They're wedded to imperialism. They don't feel much pressure from the grassroots within or outside of the party. And the only times when they do come out against wars, like 2003 Iraq invasion, the earlier Iraq invasion, the early 90s when Canada actually formally participated, the only time they do come out critical of these wars is when there is a big groundswell of popular activism. Their de facto orientation is to just go along with whatever the foreign policy establishment is pushing. It's only when there's years or decades of activism, like on the question of Palestine, for instance, where they finally start taking more sensible or justice oriented positions.
Yeah, and from my reading of history and understanding and talking to some of my recent guests, I think a third, I've been told, of Ukrainian armed forces are some sort of neo-Nazis. So it's like our Western governments are supporting, modern day Nazism, which is crazy. Do you have is there any other thought or issue, you wanted to get across?
Well, just on that, I think it's somewhat ironic that the people who label kind of so many people within Canada as, and I think often incorrectly, as Nazis or neo-Nazis, they're quick to label some right-wing activist who I may not agree with a lot of their positions. They are quick to label them Nazis, and then they're simultaneously they're happy to pump in hundreds of millions of dollars of support for a military that has literal Nazis, people who are not they're not couching anything. That is somewhat ironic or contradictory, but it fits to a long history of sort of progressive wanting sort of socialistic reforms within Canada or within North America, and then being an objective and clear ally of imperialism abroad, and you see that within the labor movement. I think to some extent less so today than previously. Part of it, of course, is just racism. Part of it is the power of the dominant media. Part of it is just it's just where it's easier to do that. There's not the organized political forces, but it's really, to me, it's really the work that we need to be doing is building those political forces that can change that political dynamic.
Yeah, you sort of answered my next question. What do we do for people like us who don't like war? And you mentioned racism as well. We've seen some clips of pundits, commentators in Europe, in the US, really freaking out about Ukraine and their situation and the refugees because it's Europe. I think even Prince William's made some comment like this. So when it's Europeans suffering like this, it's so bad, but no one talks about Yemen, for 7 years, more than 300,000 people killed by, also Western sponsored, Saudi, backing the Saudis. No one talks about that, but, somehow the European lives are more valuable. I view everyone, across the planet equally as valuable, our lives. What are the best websites and places for people to find you and to support you?
Well, for me, it's just my website, yvesengler.com. People can sign up for my newsletter. Whenever I publish a new article, you'll receive that. I'm a fellow with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and people can get on that listserv. We do, critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy and also spur some campaigning. And then, I think that there's all kinds of like left-wing Canadian media outlets that people may not be familiar with. Places like Canadian Dimension, Spring Mag, Rabble.ca, which people can see my work on sometimes.
All right, I'll include all of the links in the description, whether you're listening on Apple or some video platform. And everyone, of course, be sure at least to check out one of Yves' books. They're great if you like the subject matter we've been discussing. You can also find him on Twitter. He hasn't yet been deplatformed. Thanks for coming back on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thanks a lot for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.